We'll start with a plenary presentation by Dr. Harold Lesch from Stellenbosch University from South Africa. Harold is one of the pioneers in community translation. When I started writing about this field of, or subfield of translation studies, I started looking for references about community translation and public service translation, and the only references available back then were two papers by Harold, one paper by my colleague Bruno Dibiase, dated '87, a couple of papers by Janet Fraser from the UK, and that was pretty much it. Harold has also done a PhD, I think the only one, on community translation. He has published it in Afrikaans. Unfortunately, it's not available in English. I personally would love to see it published in English, and I'm sure everybody here would agree with me. Harold is also a member of the recently created International Community Translation Group, based here at the University of Western Sydney. He is also coordinator of the Interpreting and Translation Program. He's taught and coordinated a number of postgraduate programs there at Stellenbosch University. He's also worked as a translator and especially as a community interpreter as well as a parliamentary interpreter. So he comes to us with the right background, both in terms of professional practice and in terms of scholarly interest and production. Thank you very much, Harold, for accepting to be with us today.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. Also for the kind words, it's really much appreciated. And I'm thanking you also for inviting me for this presentation. Of course, it's a pleasure for me to be part of this, and I want to congratulate you as well as the other organizers for setting up this conference. But also, I think a conference like this has long been overdue. But once again, thank you from my side. As my title of my paper states, I'll focus from practice, community practice, then move to theory, and then I'll try to put forward norms for community translation. I'll focus on my text in front of me, and at times I'll have to move between the computer and the text, but we'll see how it goes in the presentation. It is often wrongfully believed that the notion of community translation has developed around technological platforms forming a social network where volunteer translators become a typical unspecified interest group who works together for a common goal. In the recent past, there is an increase of social networking on the web, and in the process, translation activities also become a social activity that is undertaken by internet users who are collaborating in a virtual community spirit. And this has recently also become known as community translation, that we've also discovered yesterday in the presentation. However, this presentation takes as its premise that the notion of community translation is not a new one and does not necessarily have its origin in the technological platform. The initial point of departure for community translators is that the original concern about the quality of translation is replaced by a concern of the appropriacy and accessibility of the target text, according to Fraser, Menges, and Kluwer. Translation becomes a means to an end, providing communities with a means to inform and skill themselves in putting their needs on the agenda, making effective communication with the reader the only valid measure of success. Such an approach takes societal factors into consideration for translation practice to be a teleological activity. It is pointed out that translators in a heterogeneous society should take the target audience into account, otherwise the translation will be a symbolic gesture, empty of value, and will therefore not communicate the message intended. This paper wants to reflect on community translation as being portrayed in relation to societal issues in South Africa and wanted to put forward norms for this practice. The challenge is to determine whether these norms as being developed is also relevant for crowdsourced translation for the virtual community. The paper takes as its point of departure the following, namely from Fraser: precepts, propositions, and stock in trade are all useful tools for a translator, but only insofar as they are determined in the purpose for which the translation is made and the people for whom it's being made. The problem with the way in which both translation and translation theory are taught is that translation is assumed as an end in itself rather than a means to end. No light is shed on why a translation is being made. As a result, that the techniques are taught in a pragmatic vacuum. The objectives for my paper are, number one, to set a basis for community translation as considered, also the types of community translation involved, then with specific reference to the South African context, reflect on community translation, and lastly, to propose norms for community translation. I started with the rationale in the South African context. Most of the research on language barriers originates in developed countries that experience an influx of people from less affluent countries and are encountering new difficulties with communication related to language and culture. In South Africa, the major problem is not encountering with immigrants, but with fellow South Africans. To render source text in multilingual and multicultural societies, such as ours, in which there are heterogeneous target audiences for a translation brings forth its own difficulties. Translators in such societies must take into account the various target audiences. I found myself asking if it's excusable that in a country that focuses so much on the rights of the individual since the dawn of democratization in 1994, the individual in many instances does not receive the necessary service delivery in a language he or she understands. Intercultural communication is by nature, of course, a complex activity, and it will inevitably focus or surface. The services of language intermediary are often considered to break the impasse in the communication process. The communication problem between the two parties, the service provider and the client, is often not simply a matter of language, but also societal factors came into play, or the community translator came into play, including, of course, the commissioner of the assignment. I think as a point of departure, referring to the South African context, one needs to look at relevant statistics. Now this is statistics referring to the educational setting of the various provinces in our country. The totals are there. If you break the totals down into percentages, okay, people with no schooling, 8.6%, some primary schooling, 12.2%, completed primary, 4.6%. If we want to define the community, I think yesterday the challenge is, of course, to define the community. It still is a problem for us to define the community, but if you do it in relation to the educational background, then you can see, if you take the first three, then it comes down to 24% with completed primary education. With some secondary education, then it goes up to 50-odd%, right? Depending on where you draw the boundary for the community. This can be also related to the various population groups. You have the Africans, the colours, Indians, and the whites. Of course, you'll see that the whites have the most sort of tertiary education. So against the backdrop of the above stated statistics, community in terms of education, whether it's 24% or 58%, it's significant figures, of course. Plain language came into play, especially since or during the 1990s. This was a stage in our political history where human rights were foregrounded in the Constitution, where access to information becomes very important, but also service delivery for the community and for the people in the country became very important. Needless to say, that it is of utmost importance in a democracy to inform ordinary citizens of their basic rights and responsibilities, and to do so in understandable language. Indeed, Sullivan in 2001 explicitly points out that the purpose of, for instance, drafting legislative text in plain language is to enhance the democracy and the rule of law by making legislation accessible to the people who live, whose lives it affects. Effective communication is essential for the function of public service on all levels. Consequently, within the context of communication across language barriers, it is necessary to communicate easily and precisely. People should be made aware of their rights, their privileges, but also their obligations, according to Vasily Kakos in 1989, as a lack thereof would leave them unable to communicate, participate, and to contribute to the cultural life or political life or even the social life of the country. Legal texts, for instance, are difficult to understand, and this comprehension difficulty can be attributed to, in part, to the distinct features of legal language, which are not regularly used in ordinary discourse domains. The question thus arises, how can ordinary people or the generic reader without legal training access the information in legal or government documents? The answer to this question may be found in the notion of text simplification, which aims to maximize the comprehension of written text through the simplification of their linguistic structure. According to Cornelius 2010, text simplification presupposes the existence of a source text which is regarded as too complex and too dense for a particular target audience, and therefore needs to be altered in some or other way to unlock meaning and to provide access to the information contained in such a text. I think we also need to look at, if we talk about community and translation, we also need to look at translation variation theory. What is translation variation theory? Although translation proper, which transmutes both the content and the form of the source text, is regarded as the first and most formal standard in translation, various translation procedures are often followed during translation practice. The translation brief of the translation may also vary. Translation variation is, as opposed to translation proper, derives at the contents concerned of the original by using appropriate language skills in the light of the special needs of the target text readers to enhance effective communication. In such cases, the source text is not seen as sacred, as some translation scholars tend to believe, and translation variation is not and does not belong to the field of translation according to them. They rather point out its shortcomings. In the case of translation variation, translators are given more freedom. Since translation with variation may not keep all the information and stylistic characteristics of the source text, it might encourage translation of various qualities depending on the various variables. It aims at meeting certain needs of the target readers, but it might also omit important information from the source text. According to Hong, 2002, translation variation theory aims to explain the nature of translation variation and defines it as an activity aimed at deriving the relevant contents of the source text by using appropriate adaptations such as expansion, deletion, editing, commentary, condensation, combination, etc. The following two quotations also explain translation variation. Translation variation, the first one is an activity aiming at deriving the contents concerned with the original by using appropriate adaptations. such as supplement, reduction, editing, summarization, combination, and remodeling in the light of the special needs of the readers. The second one is in the same line or less. The aim of translation variation is not to boast with the various forms of the target text, but to make the contents concerned more effective by transferring the forms flexibly and ultimately to enhance communication and partly negate the source text. What translation variation affirms is the contents of the source text which meets the demands of the target readers. What it negates is the contents which fail to satisfy the needs of the target readers, according to Zhang 2007. Translation variation serves the special needs of the target text readers and the commissioner, as it shows that the translator has a definite purpose in mind as to the question of whom the target readers are and why a certain text should be translated. It is a strategy to provide the target readers with the information that they need. As a result, the target text might not include all the information and form of the source text. In accordance to the notion of instrumental translation of Nord 1991, Hang identifies the following means of translation variation, namely addition, reduction, editing, report, condensation, combination and summary, of course, and then adaptation. In terms of quality, Campbell considers the reader, not the translator, essential for the assessment of the quality of a translation, whereas quality assessment is concerned with the text only. Campbell emphasizes that the quality of a translation reflects the translator's competence. Recently, translation scholars have confirmed that successful translation cannot be achieved without a great deal of target readers' support. Young studied translation quality and the reader's response and concluded that it is a misconception to believe that a good translation is as close, accurate, and faithful as possible to the source text. Maybe I should just add here, but if one talks about the reader's response, it's very difficult to identify the reader's response, because at times it's not open for empirical research. Sometimes it can be a mental reaction, or mental response. But he concluded that it's a misconception to believe that a good translation is as close, accurate, and faithful as possible to the source text. In order for a translation to become adequate, there must be, throughout the translation process, interaction between the translator, the source text, and the translator's notion of the target text readers, since it is the target audience's response to the translation that determines its adequacy. And I'm using the word adequacy here not as a term as Ture has used it, right? It's just a normal word, not opposed to the term adequacy or weakly adequate translation as Ture has used it. As communicators, professional translators are to produce adequate translation efficiently and effectively. In order to fulfill clients' expectations, they must pay heed to reader variables, context, and function. A translation will be judged by the degree in which it meets the recipient's experience and capacity to decode. This means that it is the audience's background, not prescriptive rules, that determine the strategies to be used for producing the best possible translation. So, from a functional point of view, translation is being viewed as a teleological activity that emphasizes that it is the use of a translation it is intended to have in the target situation that is of vital importance. I think I also need to say something about the community as such, or how do one define the community. I think, yes, from a theoretical point of view, two aspects needs to be clarified, namely community, and then also the concept of norms. Community, the depiction of community for the virtual community is defined according to Jenny Pierce 2000 as a place online that has, one, people who interact socially as they strive to satisfy their own needs or perform special roles such as leading or moderating. A shared purpose such as an interest, need, information exchange, or service that provides a reason for the community. Thirdly, policies in the form of tacit assumptions, rituals, protocols, rules, and laws that guide the people's interaction. Computer systems to support and mediate social interaction and facilitate a sense of togetherness. Right? That is for the virtual community, right? On the internet, or crowdsourcing translation if you want to. However, community is defined for this paper once again in terms of the level of education and not necessarily refer to a demographic community. The uneven power relationships and the advocacy role of the language intermediary are paramount within this definition of community. I think one of the previous colleagues also started off yesterday by referring to the dictionary's definition of community. Colin Cobble's 1990 states the following. Regarding community, as his point of departure, he states a particular group of people or part of society who are all alike in some way. If we take this point of departure of community is in this context does not so much refer to a geographical grouping of people. It rather refers to a special group in society in which people relate to one another in certain instances. The notion of belonging to the group or identifying with the group or to be part of that group is included in the term. This group is in contrast to the elite, and it's rather the working class that is relevant in this case. This group has a relative low level of education. Unemployment is rife among them. No or very limited attention is being given to language use, and plain language is generally the norm. One also can add from a sociological perspective, what does community mean? A community is defined in the sociological perspective as a social group of any size whose members are related to one another by continued relations such as social status, role fulfillment, and social networks, and often has a common cultural and historical heritage. Although Pogacar is referring to community interpreting, I think his depiction is also relevant when it comes to community translation. The statement of Pogacar 2004, even though he apparently refers to community interpreting, is also applicable for community translation. When he says, in community-based domains, the primary parties are typically of unequal social status and highly discrepant educational backgrounds. In such situations, the introduction to use the verbal or written form, in the case of translation, best suited to understanding by the audiences becomes a critical challenge. The demand on the majority of professional translators in the South African context is to translate text for what one would loosely call parallel audiences, meaning that the profile of the source text readers matches that of the target text reader who is educated in the standard language. As in the case, once again, of community interpreting, community translation aims to empower the community. A local definition, South Africa, the starting for community translation, the starting point is a recognition that the problem of communication between these two parties is not simply a matter of language. It is equally created and compounded by the fact that they are separated by a wide gap of power. This power gap is directly related to class, race, and or culture. One can even add gender also, and the differential power relations between a professional and his or her lay client. So the community translator is more, or should be more, proactive. It's not only there to translate for the clients, but to represent their interests, to assess their needs, and to help them whatever they are entitled to. The uniqueness of community translation is that the source text reader and the target text reader does not necessarily belong to the same socio-economic stratum. The translator is then required to adapt the target text to make it accessible to the target group, and in this regard, Seegren came to the conclusion that the original concern about the quality of the translation is replaced by a concern rather of the appropriateness and accessibility of the target text. According to Lesch 2012, community translation is thus a means to an end, namely to equip the community with the necessary information and other means to develop their skills for themselves. It is an attempt to balance the power relationship between the sender and the receiver by prioritizing the needs of the community. One can also look back at what Fraser said in this regard in 1990. With reference to the effectiveness of the communication process, Kluwer comments the following, and it still stays relevant even though it dates back to 1992. Translators, according to Kluwer, translators need to be sensitive to the needs of the different groups. Within any speech community, there are marginalized groups who have been excluded from mainstream developments and for whom the form in which information is encoded presents a barrier. The task of the community translator is not only to make information available in another language in a parallel manner, but to make it available to marginalized community in a more assimilable format. The empowered role that the translator should play is also echoed by Walker, Creer, and Andrews. Instead, the notion of translation needs to be expanded to include reformulations and adaptations as are necessary in order to reach the lower end of the speech community. There is no doubt that when the need exists, communication will take place, and translation is no different. In translation, or in principle, translation is an extended communication process that makes information accessible to people. Extended, of course, because it's not a linear communication. There's a third person involved, namely the translator now. That makes information accessible to people who would not otherwise would have access to that information. Access to information and to the exchange of information and ideas among a group of people aim to place people in a position to make better informed decisions, to make their own contribution, and thus to participate more fully in debates surrounding issues. This belief in the democratic trust of translation is nevertheless dependent on how this information is made available, to whom, by whom, and for what reason, and so forth. It is assumed that translation automatically makes a text accessible, but this is not necessarily the case. It is possible to translate the text from one language into another, and for it still to remain incomprehensible to the broader mass of people, or for it to remain unacceptable and alienating. People's right to easy access to information and to participation is not provided for if the translation is inaccurate or written in such a way that it constitutes to be as inaccessible as the original. In such a case, translation becomes symbolic. If we talk about the community translation, the community translator, one should once again refer to what Segrun have stated, that the community translator is neither a social worker, nor an educator, nor an advocate. The community translator is aware of the power imbalances in society and chooses to mediate in order to make target texts accessible instead of offering parallel translations. This practice, of course, necessitates certain skills from the translator. In the light thereof, the following statement can be made, namely, that for some time to come, translation in South Africa will differ radically from conventionally preconceived ideas of what translation should constitute. Translation teachers need to prepare their students adequately to meet the needs of a multilingual South Africa in their profession. What one deduces is that there is consensus among community translators that a community translation text is not of a lower standard. Linguistic interaction via translation should be actively linked to identifiable needs of the community. From a translation perspective, there should be a clearly identified language benefit for the community. The notion of reciprocity comes to mind, right? The community must also gain out of this relationship. It must be mutual beneficial for both parties. This means reciprocity between those who are being served and the community on the one side and the initiator on the other side. The initiator wants to inform according to the democratic principles, and the reader needs to information regarding privileges and obligations. For instance, voter education. I think I've also depicted various types of community translation activities, and people can differ from me, or maybe some discussion we can have afterwards about it, but various types I've identified. And the first type of translation, it's parallel community translation. It involves a source language, community text, aimed at the language impoverished as a target group, which is translated in a similar manner for a target group with an equivalent educational profile. So, people at the same level, right? For instance, grade 5 school leaving certificate, right? In the community, it's a community text. Second one, it's non-parallel community translation. It involves a source text originally written for an advanced source language group which needs to be translated for a language impoverished group. For instance, the minister is delivering a speech in Parliament, right, regarding housing, right? But this text needs to be made accessible to people in the township, right? The lowest socio or the lower educational background. It needs to be, it's a non-parallel form of translation. The housing text, for instance, but you can also look at a text concerning education, right? It is the principal that needs to have access to that document, but it's also the community once again. And the community can be people once again with the lowest school leaving certificate. Non-parallel target groups. Then intralingual community translation takes a division between interlingual, intralingual, and intersemiotic translation as a point of departure. Intralingual translation, the source text is being translated intralingually, that meaning in the same language, in the sense that it's being made accessible to a broader target reader or to a generic reader. The text is thus written into a simplified version. To illustrate, extract from principles regarding the South African Constitution way back in 1994. The original wording of the Constitution, Principle 2, states as following: everyone shall enjoy all universally accepted fundamental rights, freedoms, and civil liberties, which shall be provided for and protected by entrenched and justifiable provisions in the Constitution, which shall be drafted after having given due consideration to inter alia the fundamental rights contained in Chapter 3 of the Constitution. It's the full principle. Well, it can be translated interlingually, in the same language, right? And I must also add, it's like a contonym. You have the original text, and then there's simpler versions of the text. The most simple version of the text, it's number 6 for instance, that principle, first take number 4. That principle can be simplified as follows, namely stating the new Constitution will protect and enforce your basic rights and freedoms guided by the rights in the interim Constitution. Very last one, the popular version. There will be equal rights and freedoms for all. Right? Also pick up, there's graphics involved. Right? Make it accessible for people. People can sort of identify with it. So, interlingual community translation. The text is being made accessible to a broader target text reader. And then the fourth one, then a community translation approach implies that although both the source text reader and the target text reader are on the same level, the initiator or the commissioner of the translation process may request the translator to write his translation as if the target group were not on a parallel level to the source text group. and then the target text to be adjusted to suit a lower target group. If you look at the profile of the source text reader and the profile of the target text reader, at the same level, but the initiator nevertheless asks you to make it simpler. To illustrate, look at the brief of the commissioner of this following college, Intech College. It's a correspondence college, right? And the principles for distance education applies, and they state the following, namely, make the text, no, let's just bear in mind, the people who's receiving the original document and the people who receive the translated document, they're doing exactly the same course. So their profile is to a certain extent identical or equivalent, right? But nevertheless, the initiator asks you to make the text accessible as possible. Base the text on a grade 8 target text reader, for instance. Use short sentences, explain difficult terms. Address the reader directly. Instead of speaking about, say, or referring to you should do that, or one should do that. Now, excuse me, not you, but one should do that, or a person. The commissioner wants you to address him directly. You must do that, right? So try to get the person or the reader involved. Avoid sexist language, avoid passive sentences, etc. Right? If we take the passive sentence, for instance, people will say it's more difficult to understand. For me and you as linguists, translators, we involved with language, we will understand the passive sentence, the sentence will grasp it immediately. Right? But it's tend to be more difficult to understand it for a lay person. So, if a community translation approach is being followed, it entails that the target market of the source text and those of the target text lies on the parallel literacy level. However, the request of the commissioner is that the target text, this is the last case now, should be made accessible to the target text reader. Use short sentences, etc. The brief of the commissioner contains explicit guidelines with regards to what the type of text should be compiled. Okay, now, plain language keep on coming up, right? When we talk about community translation, the question is, what is plain language? In short, it's the opposite of gobbledygook and of confusing and incomprehensible language. Plain English is clear, straightforward expression, using only as many words as are necessary. It is a language that avoids obscurity, inflated vocabulary, and convoluted sentence construction. It is not baby talk, nor is it a simplified version of the English language. Derek Fine, 2001, states the following: plain language is accessible, it's user-friendly, it's understandable and informative. It is characterized by a lucid and well-organized structure, by clear and user-friendly layout, important, user-friendly layout, and the design of written materials and visuals. There's the visuals coming again, right? When spoken, it is presented with backups and appropriate and user-friendly tone and body language. Cornelius, in relation to Bashir, concurs that plain language is a form of intralingual translation, a process during which particular interventions are brought to bear on a complex text in order to fit the linguistic competence of a particular target audience. In this way, complicated content is unlocked and meaning mediated. The use of plain language is to decrease the cognitive processing difficulties experienced by the reader. Careful consideration must therefore be given to the linguistic features used in the alternative text. If I talk about the cognitive processes thing, the translator have two options. Number one, to think in terms of plain language before translating. Or secondly, to transfer a text into plain language during the translation process. This latter approach entails that rephrasing and adaptation is part of the construction of target texts, of course. I believe this is the better way by ensuring effective intercultural communication across power gaps. And it also relates to Gilles' gravitational model for linguistic availability. But it also, if you talk about plain language, it's also in line with what Holmes mentioned or called the so-called mapping theory. The generic reader should be in a position to compile a realistic mental perception. This image that he draws in his brain should be, you should be able to do it if it's being done or communicated by plain language. But not everybody's not in favor of plain language. Huh? Yeah.
Many people are not in favor.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I can see it also the smiles on the faces. People are not very much, or there are people that's not in favor of plain language. So let's look at a little bit of on the critique against community translation, especially in the formative years. So, a translation with variation may not preserve all the content and form characteristics of its source text, but the omitting of information should not be dismissed so easily because sometimes the omissions are necessary. Before answering whether or not a complete translation is superior to a translation with variation, we should rather ask another question. Best for whom? Right? Different translations of the same text are produced to fulfill the purposes for which a target text is intended. The relative adequacy of different translations of the same text can only be determined in terms of the extent to which each translation successfully fulfills the purpose for which it was intended. Once again, according to Chang, 2007, pages 31 to 32. Examples of critique against community translation. I think it's representative of the general critique towards community translation. The first one states, the primary responsibility to make text more accessible, acceptable and suitable rests with the author, not the translator. The language use, style and register is adjusted by the author according to the target public that he or she has in mind. In any case, that is how it should be. The translator does not necessarily know at whom the target text is aimed. Is that true?
It's true, but it should not be true.
Okay, go and take that. Let's take the next point, remark. It's one of the translators. I pointed out to the person asking about translating for adults with low reading ability that they need to ensure that the original English or Afrikaans text is targeted to adults with similar ability. It is not right to expect the translator to take a text written for English university students and expect him to translate it into Sesotho so that it can be understood by newly literate adults. Translator feels unfair towards them. Last one. A translator is not a creative artist or journalist. He or she relays the original text into the other language. Just as technical, or just as simple as the original text. It's not a creative artist. Is that true? A translation of poetry? Isn't there a creative translation coming to the fore? Or adverts? Advertisements? Another way of dealing with these critiques towards community translation is by making use of the reference to linguistics, of course, we're making use of cognitive synonyms. Cognitive synonyms as defined by Cruz to encounter the criticisms and to argue in favor of a functional text production by using truth conditional relationships between the text and the target text sentences. But before we talk about truth conditional relationships, I think one also need to refer to congruence relationships. It can be identity, inclusion, overlap, disjunction. Right? Inclusion, for instance, right? The one word or term include the other. Right? In the case of truth conditional relations, Cruz identified and made the following statement: X is a cognitive synonym of Y if one, X and Y are syntactical identical, and two, any grammatical declarative sentence containing X has equivalent truth conditions to another sentence S1, which is identical to S except that X is replaced by X. What I'm trying to do, people, with this definition is merely to motivate why it is possible to make use of a cognitive synonym to convey a similar message. Right? And he also refers to entailment, which is useful when it comes to translation and semantic analysis. I need to say something about norms still before I get to the norms that I want to give to you. Now, in translation studies, two people have wrote about norms. So one is Turi, Gideon Turi, and the other one is Chesterman. According to Turi, norms are operative at every stage in the translating process and at every level in its product. Norms can be identified in two ways. It can be descriptive, right? Describe, or it can be prescriptive, right? How it should be done, right? And he identifies different forms or different types of norms, namely initial norms, preliminary norms, operational norms, textual norms, etc. Right? I'm not going into each of the norms now. Turi, 1980, 1985, written about norms. Okay, but Chesterman, more recently, 2000, also draws a distinction between expectancy norms and professional norms, right? Competent norms, etc. With the various norms in the back of our mind, we can sort of go back to the norms as I would propose, and once again, it's not cast in stone. The initial norm. Initial norm, it's concept or term from Turi. That's now the norms for community translation. The first one, the community translation should subject himself to the prevailing linguistic and community norms of the target text and the target language polysystem, or part thereof, and not to those of the source text. This is to ensure that an acceptable target text is generated and not a weakly adequate translation. And now, weakly, or rather adequate, is being used as a term, right? Weakly adequate translation. Turi draws a distinction between an adequate translation and an acceptable translation, right? An adequate translation, it says a weakly adequate translation. It's a literal translation. So the initial norm, I would like to state, it should be acceptable, you should subject yourself to the norms of the language polysystem of the target text. Excuse me, of the target text and not of those of the source text. Second one is your preliminary norm. One should not mention that the target text is translation, but should rather ensure that the target text should take the form of a recovered translation. The translation should be domesticated and take the form of a second original, and the reader should not realize that it is a translation. The cover translation, once again, comes from the theoretical background of Nord. He or she draws a distinction between overt translation and covert translation. Within the framework, not Nord, excuse me, of House. House, sorry. Nord draws a distinction between instrumental translation and documentary translation. Within the framework of Nord, an instrumental translation should be preferred as opposed to a documentary translation. The last one is Venuti. Draws a distinction between a domesticated translation in contrast to a foreignized translation. It should be domesticated. I would argue in favor of a domesticated translation. Newmark, a little bit further back, he draws a distinction between semantic and communicative translation. Operational norms. The operational norms should be in accordance with the manner in which the community is characterized. Right? We have identified the definition of the community, so the operational norms must be in line with that. For the plain language that is accessible language is of paramount importance. A balance is struck between language purism and meaningful innovation. The underlying principle for operational norms seems to be the notion of accessible language use in relation to the community's background. The first norm under operational norms is the encoding norms. Norm number 3, the translation should be grammatically sound and the orthography should be correct and in accordance with the grammatical rules of the target language. Right? No spelling errors. Grammatical sentences, right? But also it's in line with the professional norms of Chesterman, right? The professional product. Norm number 4, use informal language and style that is accessible for the mental perception of the target reader regional speech, regional speech, however, should be used with great care. That is now dialect language. The language should be reader friendly and the reader should be able to identify. Number 5, encode information via simplistic syntactic structures. Right? Use short sentences. Coming back to the brief of that Intech college, right, that I had on this slide, with clear antecedents and the case where an anaphora needs to be established. The norm should be read in line with norms number 4 and also the mapping theory once again of Holmes. Involve the reader by addressing him or her directly by using or asking questions, right? Not a person or one, but you, right? That involve the reader. The reading experience of the translated text should be an activity or be an active act by the potential reader, according to Fine. 7, explicate source text information in the target text by using paraphrases such as, in other words, trying to explain, meaning or makes use of, additions or provide examples. In this manner, certain information will be concretized and the text will be clearer to the reader. The text layout or the structure, right? Text layout norms, condense paragraphs in order to make the target text more accessible. For example, long sentences should be shortened, especially in the case of technical information. 9. Synchronize the text by grouping the information together and reorganizing the content if necessary. This again is relevant to ensure coherence by means of text structuring mechanisms and the notion of manipulation of segmentation. Once again, it's a term of Turing. Use headings. I think somebody also mentioned it yesterday. Headings and subheadings to enhance the reading and understanding of the material. The reader will immediately recall information by just reading the appropriate heading of a specific paragraph. I should also add that my corpus was very limited. So these norms can be extended, they can be more. Right? Or after working through another example, a couple of more examples, no, we don't need norm number 5, for instance. To conclude, the overarching aim for developing these norms is to meet the linguistic generic reader within the South African context at any level of linguistic competence and social integration. One concurs with Fraser that the sensitivity and orientation to the audience makes a community translator's approach to translation a more helpful one propounded in translation theory, especially for the generic target text reader. This approach and norms, of course, is cognizance of the fact that translation cannot exist in a vacuum. It has a purpose and an identity, only insofar as it is read and understood by the target or receptor audience. A last remark, and that is namely, the challenge, of course, is, and I'm looking now to you, the challenge, of course, is whether these norms are also relevant when it comes to crowdsourced translation or for the community, the virtual community. Thank you.